I am Zuri. I am 36 years old, and I run one of the top crisis management and public relations firms in Atlanta. Last weekend at our annual family barbecue, I accidentally bumped into my husband's 20-year-old daughter, Jada. She immediately screamed at the top of her lungs, telling me to never touch her again. The entire backyard went completely silent. My husband Trey did not even ask what happened. He just looked at me with pure ice in his eyes and said to apologize to her right now or get out. So I took off my apron, set it on the table, and walked away. What they did not know was that by the time they finished their little party and drove back to what they thought was their luxury home, a massive shock would be waiting for them on the front lawn. Before I get into the details of exactly how I dismantled their entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind a toxic family member exactly who holds the power. To understand how we reached that breaking point, you have to understand the dynamic of my so-called family. It was the 4th of July, and the Georgia heat was already suffocating by noon. My mother-in-law Vivian hosts a massive cookout every single year at her sprawling brick estate in Buckhead. Vivian is the self-appointed matriarch of the family, a woman who values social status, church appearances, and family image above absolutely everything else. She is also a woman who has never hidden her disdain for me. Despite the fact that I built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up, Vivian always viewed me as a threat to her son's masculinity. Trey is 42 years old, a regional director for a logistics company who constantly needs to project the image of an alpha male provider. The reality of our financial situation is vastly different, but I spent years playing the supportive wife, keeping my success quietly in the background so his fragile ego could thrive in the spotlight. That afternoon, I was doing exactly what was expected of a good daughter-in-law. While the rest of the family mingled on the wrap-around porch sipping sweet tea and signature cocktails, I was stuck in the humid kitchen carrying heavy aluminum trays of ribs, baked beans, and potato salad out to the buffet tables. I did not mind the work itself. I grew up working hard, and I know how to contribute to a family gathering. What I minded was the blatant disrespect that hung in the air every time I stepped outside. The family treated me less like a successful entrepreneur and more like the hired help. And the absolute worst offender was Jada. Jada is Trey's daughter from a previous relationship. She is 20 years old, currently attending Spelman College, and has been spoiled beyond comprehension her entire life. Trey overcompensates for his past mistakes by giving her a credit card with no limit, while Vivian treats her like royalty. From the moment Trey and I started dating, Jada made it her personal mission to ensure I knew my place. She viewed me as an interloper, a gold digger trying to steal her father's wealth, which is highly ironic considering I make triple his salary. She never calls me by my name unless she absolutely has to, usually referring to me as her dad's new wife, even though we have been married for 5 years. As I arranged the food on the patio tables, I could hear Vivian holding court near the pool. She was surrounded by her church friends and extended family, talking loudly enough to make sure I heard every word. She was going on and on about how brilliant Jada was doing at Spelman, boasting about her grades and her sorority activities. Then she smoothly transitioned into a thinly veiled insult directed at me. She told her friends that it takes a real woman with a maternal instinct to raise a child, right, implying that career-obsessed women simply lack the warmth necessary for family life. I just kept arranging the serving spoons, keeping my face perfectly neutral. In my line of work, you learn never to let them see you sweat. You learn to read the room, collect the data, and wait for the precise moment to strike. Jada was lounging on a chaise chair nearby, tapping away on the latest smartphone that I had actually paid for. She was wearing a designer sundress and a pair of sunglasses that cost more than my first car. When I walked past her to adjust the umbrella shading the desserts, she deliberately scoffed and rolled her eyes. I asked her politely if she could move her designer tote bag off the food table so I could set down the fresh tray of cornbread. Instead of simply moving it, she looked at me over the rim of her sunglasses and said that the bag was worth more than my catering services, so I should just find somewhere else to put the food. The disrespect was palpable, Several of my husband's cousins heard her and simply looked away, pretending not to notice the blatant insult. I looked over at Trey, hoping my husband would finally step in and correct his daughter's behavior. Instead, he was laughing loudly with his brother Malik holding a beer and completely ignoring the toxic dynamic unfolding right in front of him. Trey always took the path of least resistance when it came to his family. He expected me to be the bigger person, to swallow my pride and just accept the disrespect because Jada grew up without a stable mother figure. For years, I had done exactly that. I had compromised my own peace to maintain the illusion of his perfect family. I paid the bills, I funded the lifestyle, and I absorbed the insults while they paraded around playing the role of high society elites. The tension in the backyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time I walked past Jada, she would mutter something under her breath to her cousins, snickering and pointing in my direction. Vivian would look over and smile an encouraging look that validated Jada's horrible attitude. They had created an echo chamber of entitlement, feeding off each other's negativity. I was the outsider, the hardworking woman who did not fit into their pretentious narrative. They thought because I stayed quiet, I was weak. They thought because I served the food, I was subordinate. They completely, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my silence. As a crisis manager, I do not react to petty provocations. I observe the weaknesses in my opponents, and I prepare for total dismantling. I continued to weave through the crowded backyard, carrying fresh towels for the pool guests and collecting empty cups. The summer air smelled of charcoal smoke and expensive perfume, a strange mix that perfectly captured the essence of my in-laws. I could feel the hostile energy radiating from the corner where Jada sat holding her court of admiring relatives. She was deliberately loud, making sure her laughter pierced through the background music every time I came near. It was a calculated performance designed to show everyone that she held the social power in this family, while I was merely a temporary fixture, tolerated only because I happened to be married to her father. The afternoon dragged on, the heat rising, along with the unspoken hostility, preparing the perfect stage for the collision that was about to happen. Before I could even formulate a response to Trey, an unwanted hand landed softly on my bare shoulder. I turned my head to see Harper, my brother-in-law Malik's wife, stepping into the center of the patio to insert herself squarely into my business. Harper is a wealthy white woman from Connecticut who married into this family 5 years ago and immediately appointed herself the resident expert on our cultural dynamics. She runs a boutique nonprofit organization that she constantly posts about on social media, and she loves using therapy speak to mediate situations that have absolutely nothing to do with her. She wore a breezy linen dress and a deeply concerned expression that looked like she had practiced it in the mirror all morning. "Zuri, let us just take a collective breath," she said, lowering her voice to that soothing, condescending tone you would use on a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "We are all family here. I know you are feeling defensive right now, but we really need to look at the bigger picture and practice some radical empathy." I stared at her hand on my shoulder. I looked directly into her eyes and held her gaze until she blinked and slowly pulled her hand back, clearly unsettled by my silence. I did not say a single word. I just waited for her to dig her own grave. "You see," Zuri Harper continued, gesturing vaguely toward Jada, who was still clinging to Vivian. "You have to understand the deep-seated trauma that comes with being a young Black woman, growing up without her biological mother, consistently in the home. There are profound abandonment issues there. There is a generational pain and a systemic anxiety that you simply cannot dismiss just because you feel your personal pride has been injured today." Jada is acting out from a place of deep hurt and emotional scarcity. As the adult in the room and as an educated woman of color, you need to decenter your own ego. You need to show her what grace and healing actually look like. Getting down and cleaning that bag isn't about submission, Zuri. It is about breaking toxic cycles. It is about doing the work to heal a fractured family dynamic. The sheer audacity of her monologue nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. Here was a highly privileged white woman standing in a Buckhead backyard, lecturing me, a self-made black woman who fought her way out of poverty through sheer grit, about generational trauma and decentering my ego. She was entirely weaponizing social justice buzzwords and pseudo-psychology to justify a spoiled 20-year-old throwing a vicious tantrum over a spilled drink. It was a masterclass in performative allyship masking absolute disrespect. I glanced around the patio to gauge the audience. Malik was nodding along with his wife's speech, looking incredibly profound, as if she had just quoted scripture. Vivian had a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, clearly thrilled that even her white daughter-in-law was putting me in my proper place. And Trey, my husband, stood taller, his chest puffed out, fully validating this ridiculous display. He looked at me with an expectant glare, waiting for Harper's lecture to break my spirit and force me to my knees. He honestly believed this united front would finally break my independence. In my line of work, crisis management relies on identifying the exact moment a situation is no longer salvageable. You do not waste resources trying to repair a burning building when the foundation has already turned to ash. You secure the perimeter, you protect your vital assets, and you walk away to build somewhere else. Looking at Trey's smug, entitled face, I realized my marriage was not just burning. It had been ashes for years. I had simply been paying for the smoke and mirrors. I had subsidized his alpha male fantasy while shrinking myself to fit into his deeply insecure life. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate did not even spike. I did not give them the angry, bitter reaction they were all so desperately waiting for me to fulfill. Instead, I reached behind my back and found the knot of my expensive catering apron. I pulled the strings loose. The heavy fabric slipped off my shoulders. I folded it deliberately, smoothing out the creases with steady, slow hands, and placed it gently on the cedar table next to the remaining trays of food. The silence in the backyard was absolute. The entire party watched my hands, waiting for my compliance or my explosion. I gave them neither. I maintained a chilling, absolute stillness. I looked at Harper first. "Thank you for that fascinating sociological breakdown, Harper," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "You should save that exact speech for your next charity gala. I am sure your wealthy donors will eat it up." Harper's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She opened her mouth to argue, but I had already turned my back on her, completely dismissing her existence. My eyes locked onto my husband. Trey was no longer looking triumphant. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his features as he realized I was not moving toward the puddle of pink lemonade on the stone patio. I was stepping away from it. "All right, Trey," I said, projecting my voice just enough so that every single guest in that backyard could hear my final verdict loud and clear. "You want to be the undisputed alpha. You want to demand submission to protect your fragile ego in front of your mother. I will not stop you. You have exactly one evening left to enjoy being the master of this house." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his authoritative tone wavering slightly. "Do not walk away from me when I am talking to you, Zuri," I said. "Clean up the mess right now." I did not bother to respond to his command. I simply picked up my phone and my car keys from the nearby table. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as I walked through the patio, heading straight for the side gate. I did not look at Vivian. I did not look at Jada, who had suddenly stopped her fake crying and was staring at me with genuine confusion. I kept my head held high, my shoulders pulled back, and my posture flawless. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone pathway, a steady marching beat of finality. "Zuri!" Trey yelled from the patio, his voice cracking with genuine panic now. The reality that I was not backing down was finally sinking into his thick skull. "If you walk out that gate, do not bother coming back." I pushed the heavy wooden gate open and stepped out onto the pristine driveway where my slate-gray Porsche Panamera was parked. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the car chirped twice, unlocking with a satisfying mechanical click. I opened the driver's side door, sliding into the cool leather seat. Through the windshield, I could see Trey standing near the edge of the house, flanked by Malik and Harper. They were staring at me, expecting me to hesitate. They thought this was a temporary bluff. They thought I would sit in my car, cry for a few minutes, and then come back inside to make peace and beg for my marriage. I started the engine. The powerful roar of the Porsche echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood, drowning out the sound of Trey calling my name one last time. I shifted into gear, pulled smoothly out of Vivian's long, sweeping driveway, and merged onto the main road without looking in the rearview mirror once. The Atlanta heat beat down on the pavement outside, but inside my car, the air conditioning was ice cold, matching the exact temperature of my heart. The time for keeping the peace and protecting Trey's ego was officially over. It was time to initiate protocol and burn his world to the ground. I merged onto the interstate highway, the twin-turbo engine of my Porsche roaring to life. I reached out and turned up the volume on the stereo. A heavy rhythmic bass line filled the cabin, matching the steady calculating pulse pounding in my temples. Every time the beat dropped, my mind snapped back to a different memory, a different red flag I had willingly painted white for the sake of love. The beat hit. I was sitting at a five-star steakhouse downtown 6 months ago. Trey was at the head of the table holding court with his fraternity brothers and their wives. He ordered 3 bottles of expensive champagne without blinking an eye. "I got this," he announced loudly, pulling a sleek metal credit card from his wallet. He basked in the applause, soaking up the praise for being such a generous provider. The memory shifted sharply to the next morning. I was sitting at my home office desk, staring at the notification on my laptop. That sleek metal card was linked directly to my company's operating account. I paid the $3,000 bill so his friends could continue believing he was the undisputed king of Atlanta. The highway lights flashed across my windshield in quick succession. I pressed my foot harder on the gas pedal. For 5 years I had been the invisible scaffolding holding up his towering ego. The music thumped again. Another memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. We were in our bedroom. I had just closed a massive crisis management contract with a tech firm. I was exhausted, but proud. Trey walked in, completely ignoring my celebration, and dropped a folder on my lap. It was a foreclosure notice for a property his mother Vivian had secretly purchased and failed to maintain. "We need to handle this, Zuri," he said, using the word "we" to mask his own failure. "A man takes care of his mother. I need you to wire the funds by Tuesday. Just consider it an advance on my bonus." His bonus never materialized. My hard-earned money vanished into Vivian's bloated real estate mistake, and Trey walked into church that Sunday, accepting praises from the congregation for being such a devoted, successful son. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My knuckles turned white. My crisis management firm specialized in mitigating disasters for politicians and celebrities. I was an expert at stopping financial hemorrhages, yet I had allowed the biggest liability to sleep in my own bed. The beat dropped harder. A memory from just 3 months ago flashed before my eyes. Trey and Jada were sitting in our living room. Jada was complaining about needing a new car to commute to her sorority events at Spelman. Trey puffed out his chest, completely dismissing the perfectly good sedan I had helped her buy a year earlier. "My daughter does not drive used cars," he declared, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Daddy is going to get you something brand new. Whatever you want, princess." He made the promise. He soaked up the adoration. He played the ultimate provider. 2 days later, he came to my office, closing the door behind him, with a sheepish smile that I now recognized as purely predatory. He spun a ridiculous story about his corporate logistics accounts being temporarily frozen due to a regional audit. He needed me to co-sign the loan for Jada's new Mercedes, just as a formality. He promised to take over the payments immediately. I signed the paper to keep the peace. I had been making the $1,000 monthly payments ever since. I remembered the family vacations to Cabo and Paris. Trey would stand at the resort bars handing out $100 bills as tips, acting like a titan of industry. Behind closed doors, I was the one negotiating the travel packages and transferring funds from my high-yield savings accounts to ensure his credit cards did not decline at the front desk. Every time his brother Malik asked him for business advice, Trey would speak with absolute authority, regurgitating the exact financial strategies he had overheard me discussing with my corporate clients. He wore my success like a tailored suit, claiming the fit was all his own. The car sped through the night. The illusion was completely shattered. Trey was not a regional director climbing the corporate ladder. He was a middle management employee, drowning in debt, desperately trying to maintain a facade of wealth that he could never afford. He needed me not for love, but for survival. I was his bank. I was his safety net. I was the silent partner funding his elaborate stage play. Vivian thought she was looking down on me because of my background, but the absolute truth was that my background gave me the hustle required to finance her entire family's fraudulent lifestyle. They despised me because I was a self-made woman, yet they had absolutely no problem reaching into my pockets to maintain their own illusions of grandeur. I pressed the button on my dashboard to lower the windows, letting the warm evening air rush into the cabin. The wind whipped around me, carrying away the last remnants of the dutiful wife I had been pretending to be. I had compromised my brilliance to make him comfortable. I had dimmed my own light so his fragile masculinity could cast a shadow. I had allowed Harper to lecture me on systemic issues while I was literally the system keeping her brother-in-law out of bankruptcy. I had let Vivian treat me like the help while my bank account paid for the catered food she was currently serving to her guests. The beat of the music hit its final crescendo, filling the car with a fierce, driving energy. I was not crying. I was not angry. Anger is a useless emotion that clouds judgment and makes you reckless. Instead, I felt an exhilarating, razor-sharp focus taking over my entire body. Trey had pushed me too far tonight. He thought making me kneel in front of his family would solidify his dominance. He thought public humiliation would force me into submission. Instead, it had shattered the final chain binding me to his pathetic masquerade. He had forced me to choose between my dignity and my marriage, completely forgetting that a woman who builds an empire from scratch never negotiates her dignity. The realization was absolute and empowering. Trey was nothing without my infrastructure. Jada's designer lifestyle was entirely dependent on my tolerance. They had mistaken my love for weakness and my financial support for an obligation. As the highway stretched out before me, leading me back to the city, I shifted my mind from personal heartbreak to professional execution. I was no longer a wife dealing with a disrespectful family. I was a crisis manager dealing with a hostile corporate takeover. He had enjoyed the benefits of my success for 5 years while actively participating in my disrespect. Now he was about to learn exactly what happens when the funding is permanently cut off. I guided the Porsche off the interstate, taking the familiar exit toward downtown Atlanta. I did not go back to our shared house. That house was a battlefield I would return to later when I was fully armed. Instead, I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my firm's corporate headquarters. The thick concrete walls offered a cool, silent sanctuary, completely insulated from the humid, chaotic energy of Vivian's backyard. I turned off the engine, but the adrenaline in my veins was still running at redline. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up my encrypted iPad. For the past 6 months, I had not just been playing the role of an oblivious wife. I had been an auditor. It started with a seemingly innocent, misplaced receipt and a minor discrepancy in our joint operating account that Trey tried to brush off as a banking glitch. But you do not build a premier crisis management firm by ignoring red flags. You dig. And I dug deep. I bypassed his flimsy passwords and looked right through the financial smokescreens he thought were so incredibly clever. I had even hired a forensic accountant under a strict non-disclosure agreement to trace every single dime. I unlocked the screen with my fingerprint. The bright display illuminated the dark cabin of my car, casting a blue glow over the leather steering wheel. I opened a master file labeled Project T. Yes, I had officially reduced my husband of 5 years to a corporate case file. It was the only psychological mechanism I had to process the sheer volume of his deceit without completely losing my mind. My finger hovered over the screen before tapping to open a subfolder marked Joint Account Discrepancies. I pulled up the transaction history from late January. There it was, staring back at me in cold, hard black and white digits. A massive wire transfer of $50,000. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering the exact conversation we had the night before that money vanished from our portfolio. Trey had sat on the edge of our California king bed, looking uncharacteristically solemn and deeply reflective. He had spun a beautiful, heartfelt narrative about wanting to establish a meaningful legacy. He claimed his college alumni association was setting up a specialized minority scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in the greater Atlanta area. He told me he wanted to be a founding donor. He wanted to be the man who gave back to the community and helped lift up the next generation. He looked me dead in the eyes, held my hands, and said it would cement his reputation as a true community leader. Touched by his supposed generosity and his desire to do something impactful, I authorized the transfer from our high-yield joint investment account without a second thought. I swiped left on the iPad screen, bringing up the actual destination of those cleared funds. The forensic trace was undeniable. The routing numbers did not lead to a charitable foundation. They did not go to an alumni association or a nonprofit organization. They led directly to the corporate account of a luxury automotive dealership in Alpharetta. $50,000. The exact amount required for the hefty down payment and the first year of premium insurance on a pearl-white Mercedes-Benz C-Class. The sickening puzzle pieces snapped together with perfect mathematical precision. 3 weeks after that wire transfer cleared, Jada had driven that exact pearl-white Mercedes into Vivian's driveway. She had paraded around the neighborhood screaming and hugging Trey, jumping up and down in excitement. She had loudly thanked her daddy for working so incredibly hard to buy her a dream car just for making the dean's list at Spelman. I vividly remembered standing on the porch that day watching the spectacle unfold. Trey had stood there, chest puffed out, soaking up the adoration of his daughter and the glowing praises of his mother and brother. He had played the role of the ultimate provider flawlessly. He had bought his daughter's affection and purchased his family's respect using the money I generated from working 80-hour weeks managing corporate disasters. He stole from my sweat equity to fund a fake scholarship that actually just financed his spoiled daughter's luxury commute. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. It was not just the financial loss. $50,000 was a fraction of what my firm brought in during a single quarter. I could absorb the financial hit. What I could not absorb was the unadulterated disrespect. He had looked his wife in the eye, played on my philanthropic values, and weaponized my empathy to steal from me. He used the noble concept of helping underprivileged Black youth to buy a shiny toy for an entitled girl who routinely treated the woman paying for the car like absolute garbage. I stared at the banking PDF until the numbers began to blur on the screen. The irony was almost poetic. Jada had just spent the entire afternoon at the barbecue, calling me classless and acting like she was inherently superior to me. She walked around clutching a Christian Dior tote bag and driving a luxury European sedan, completely blind to the fact that her entire high society aesthetic was fully subsidized by my bank account. She hated me, but she was literally living off the crumbs of my empire. Trey thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. The forensic report showed he had funneled the money through a dummy limited liability company he set up under his brother Malik's name before it hit the dealership. He added an extra layer of routing, thinking it would wash the transaction clean. He actually thought he was smarter than a woman who handles multi-million-dollar corporate espionage and public relations scandals for a living. He thought my silence over the past few months meant I was clueless. I tapped the screen again, pulling up the ownership documents for the vehicle. Because Trey's credit score was a complete disaster, he could not secure the remaining financing for the car on his own. The dealership records showed my name listed as the primary guarantor on the loan. I was legally on the hook for a car driven by a girl who had just screamed at me to get out of her grandmother's backyard. A cold, predatory calm washed over me, pushing out any lingering traces of marital grief. When a business partner embezzles funds, you do not cry. You do not ask for couples counseling. You freeze the assets and you liquidate the partnership. Trey had breached the contract. He had operated in bad faith, and he had publicly disrespected the primary stakeholder. I closed the banking application and opened my secure messaging portal. The time for quietly gathering evidence in the shadows was over. The time for aggressive asset recovery had officially begun. I needed to lock him out of every single financial pipeline before he realized the game was up. I tapped the contact from my lead corporate attorney. The engine of my retaliation was fully fueled, and it was time to hit the ignition. The phone barely rang twice before Marcus answered. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I simply told him that Project T was no longer a contingency plan, but an active protocol. I instructed him to freeze every joint account block, all secondary cardholder access, and immediately initiate the separation of assets. Marcus, who had helped me build my corporate structure from day one, did not ask any emotional questions. He only asked for the specific timeline. I told him I wanted everything locked down within the hour. After ending the call, I closed the banking application on my iPad and opened the most important file in my entire digital vault. The folder was simply labeled Real Estate Holdings. I tapped on the primary document, and a high-resolution scan of a property deed filled the screen. If the $50,000 car loan was the final insult, this document was my ultimate weapon. It was the absolute fail-safe I had engineered long before I ever walked down the aisle. For the past 5 years, Trey had played the role of the master of the manor. Our primary residence is a sprawling, custom-built 6-bedroom contemporary mansion situated on 2 acres of prime real estate in an exclusive gated community. It features imported Italian marble countertops, a climate-controlled wine cellar, a fully equipped home theater, and a massive outdoor kitchen where Trey loves to host his friends. He treats that house like his personal kingdom. He frequently invites his fraternity brothers over for cigar nights, giving them grand tours and boasting about the custom upgrades he supposedly negotiated. He walks through the vaulted hallways with his chest puffed out, pointing out the architectural details as if he designed them himself. Vivian is even worse. My mother-in-law regularly brings the senior ladies from her church committee over for afternoon tea, strictly for the purpose of showing off. I have stood in my own kitchen pouring coffee while listening to Vivian tell her friends that her brilliant son purchased a multi-million-dollar estate before he turned 40. I would watch Trey stand there, soaking in the praise, accepting the admiration, and never once correcting her. He never once mentioned that his name was nowhere near the actual title of the property. The truth staring back at me on the illuminated iPad screen was beautifully, ruthlessly simple. I bought that mansion entirely in cash exactly 6 months before Trey and I got married. I did not use a mortgage broker, and I certainly did not combine our finances. Because of my background in crisis management and risk assessment, I never leave my personal assets vulnerable to emotional decisions. I worked with my wealth management team to purchase the property under a blind trust managed by a holding company called Aegis Strategic Investments, LLC. I am the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of that corporation. Trey has absolutely no idea how complex property law actually works. When we were engaged and moving in together, I presented him with a stack of documents disguised as standard homeowner insurance forms and tax optimization paperwork. I used heavy corporate jargon, explaining that structuring our residence through an LLC would protect us from personal liability if my public relations firm ever got sued. His ego was so massive and his actual financial literacy so incredibly low that he nodded along vigorously. He pretended to understand exactly what I was talking about because he never wanted to look uneducated in front of me. He signed exactly where I told him to sign. What he actually signed was a legally binding residential occupancy agreement. On paper, in the eyes of the state of Georgia, Trey is not a homeowner. He does not have a single drop of marital equity in the property. Legally speaking, my husband is nothing more than a tenant at will. He pays 0 rent, he holds 0 ownership, and he can be asked to vacate the premises at the sole discretion of the LLC management. I zoomed in on his signature at the bottom of the PDF. The irony of the situation was intoxicating. Just an hour ago in his mother's backyard, Trey had the absolute audacity to give me an ultimatum. He told me to get down on my knees to apologize to his spoiled daughter or get out of the family. He thought he held the power of eviction. He truly believed that because he yelled the loudest, he controlled the environment. He thought he could banish me from his life and return to his luxurious mansion to celebrate his dominance. He was going to return to a house he did not own. He was going to park a car he could not afford in a driveway that belonged exclusively to the woman he had just publicly humiliated. He had spent years promising Jada that the house would be her inheritance. He had told his brother Malik that they could borrow against the home's equity to fund Malik's failing business ventures. They had built an entire dynasty of entitlement on a foundation of brick and mortar that I owned free and clear. I swiped to the next page of the legal file. It was the standard eviction notice template that Marcus and I had drafted months ago when I first noticed the banking discrepancies. It was completely filled out, perfectly legal, and ready to be executed. As a tenant at will without a fixed-term lease, Trey had absolutely no legal standing to remain on the property once the owner revoked permission. Because the home was owned by a corporate entity rather than an individual spouse, the standard marital home protections did not apply. The assets were completely shielded from any potential divorce proceedings. The cool air conditioning of the Porsche blew against my face, but I felt a profound radiating heat of vindication. They wanted to treat me like a common servant. They wanted to reduce me to the woman who carried the trays and cleaned up the messes while they lived like royalty. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about the true nature of power. Power is not screaming in a backyard. Power is not wearing designer clothes bought with stolen money. Power is holding the deed to the castle while everyone else is just playing make-believe. I minimized the legal document and opened my email application. I attached the eviction notice along with the asset freeze confirmation and the corporate ownership records. I addressed the email directly to my dedicated private security team. They were a group of highly trained former law enforcement officers who handled physical security for my high-profile corporate clients. They were discreet, ruthlessly efficient, and fiercely loyal to my firm. I typed out my instructions with rapid, precise keystrokes. The emotional wife who tried to blend into the background was officially dead. The corporate executive had taken the wheel. I was about to turn my personal life into a masterclass on crisis neutralization. I checked the digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 5 p.m. I had 3 hours before the sun went down, and I intended to use every single minute of it to dismantle the fake reality Trey had built. I hit send on the email and immediately dialed the direct line to Vance, the head of my private security detail. Vance is a former federal agent who handles high-risk extractions and asset protection for my most vulnerable corporate clients. He is a man of few words and absolute precision, which is exactly why he is on my payroll. He picked up on the very first ring. "Vance," I said, keeping my voice stripped of any lingering emotion. "I sent over a highly sensitive dossier to your encrypted inbox. Review the legal attachments immediately." I listened to the steady, rapid tapping of his keyboard on the other end of the line. It took him exactly 15 seconds to open the file, verify the judicial signatures on the asset freeze, and process the eviction notice. "Understood," he said simply. "What are your specific orders?" "Activate Protocol 4. "Oh, 4, I commanded. "I want a full tactical lockdown of the primary residence effective immediately. Wipe the entire biometric database at the front gates and the main doors. Delete all fingerprint access codes for Trey and Jada. Contact the neighborhood security pavilion and blacklist Trey's license plate. As of this exact second, they are entirely locked out of the property and flagged as trespassers." "Copy that," Vance replied, his tone strictly business. "And regarding their personal belongings inside the residence, I want a full sweep of the master suite and the East Wing guest room," I instructed. "Pack every single item belonging to Trey and Jada, the tailored suits, the custom sneakers, the designer handbags, the jewelry, and the electronics. I do not care if your team has to use heavy-duty contractor trash bags or the cardboard boxes left over in the storage unit. Just get it all out of the house. I want everything they own stacked neatly on the front lawn before 8 o'clock tonight." I paused, making sure my next words were crystal clear. "And Vance, I do not mean the covered porch. I mean the grass. I want it sitting right there on the sod where the entire gated community can see it clearly when they drive past. We will have a rapid response team on site in 20 minutes, Vance confirmed. "We will supervise the packing process and secure the perimeter. If he leaves the barbecue early and shows up while we are working, how do you want us to proceed?" "Do not let him step a single foot past the property line," I said. "Hand him the eviction notice through the gate." If he gets loud or attempts to act aggressively, do not engage in a physical altercation. Let the local police handle his temper tantrum. I have already informed the precinct captain about the asset freeze and the active eviction order. They are ready to dispatch units if he causes a disturbance. I disconnected the call and took a slow, deliberate breath. The physical perimeter was secured, but I needed to establish the financial border. The eviction notice would wound his pride, but cutting off the money supply would completely paralyze him. I opened my firm's encrypted banking application on the iPad. I navigated through the secure portals until I reached the corporate accounts and the secondary cardholder access lists. Trey had a platinum corporate card he used exclusively to fund his luxurious social life. Jada had a secondary gold card linked to my primary checking account, which she treated like a bottomless ATM for her college expenses and shopping sprees. With 2 deliberate, precise swipes, I suspended both accounts. I did not just pause them temporarily. I permanently canceled the cards, removed their names from the authorized user list, and flagged the accounts to block any pending transactions. I systematically went through the digital wallets, disabling their Apple Pay access and canceling the auto draft payments I had set up for their personal cell phone bills and memberships. In my mind, I pictured Trey standing at the outdoor bar of his mother's house, offering to pay for a premium bottle of liquor to impress his brother Malik. I pictured him handing over that heavy metal card with his signature confident smirk, only for the bartender to return and tell him the card was declined. I pictured Jada sitting poolside trying to buy another overpriced accessory online to soothe her ego, only to see a bright red error message flash across her screen. The financial umbilical cord was officially and permanently severed. I was no longer the silent benefactor funding their profound disrespect. The Bank of Zuri was permanently closed. I sat back against the leather seat of my Porsche, letting the absolute silence of the underground garage wrap around me like a protective shield. For the first time in 5 long years, my chest did not feel tight with the anxiety of managing Trey's fragile ego. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be less than I was, just so he could feel like a dominant man, had completely evaporated. I had spent half a decade watering a dead plant, hoping it would miraculously bear fruit. Now I was uprooting the entire garden and salting the earth. Setting an absolute boundary is not a negotiation. It is a declaration of self-worth. I had given Trey every conceivable opportunity to be a genuine partner. I had provided the resources, the emotional support, and the unwavering loyalty required to build a lasting dynasty together. Instead, he chose to play a petty game of dominance in a backyard barbecue. He wanted to force me to kneel in front of his family to prove he was the master of his domain. He failed to realize that true masters do not need to demand submission from their partners. True masters control the access to the kingdom. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a confirmation text from Marcus, my lead attorney. The asset freeze order had been successfully filed and stamped by the duty judge. Trey's personal bank accounts, which relied entirely on automatic transfers from my business, were now effectively frozen, pending the marital separation audit. He could not move a single dollar. He could not secure a hotel room for the night. He could not even pay for a rental car without his card bouncing. He was stranded on an island of his own making. I reached forward and pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life, vibrating through the steering wheel, and up my arms, a mechanical reflection of my own renewed energy. I put the car in drive and guided it toward the exit ramp of the parking garage. The heavy metal security gate rolled upward, revealing the vibrant orange and purple hues of the Atlanta sunset. I had roughly 2 hours until the deadline I gave Vance. 2 hours before Trey, Jada, and his entitled family would leave that barbecue and drive back to the mansion, expecting to find me crying and packing my bags in the master bedroom. I pulled out onto the busy city street, joining the steady flow of evening traffic. I decided to head to a quiet, upscale lounge located a few miles away from my neighborhood. I needed a comfortable vantage point. Vance had already synced the security camera feeds from the mansion directly to my phone. I would be able to watch the entire operation unfold in real time from the comfort of a private velvet booth with a glass of expensive bourbon in my hand. The transition from accommodating wife to formidable adversary was finally complete. I was no longer emotionally invested in his reaction or his mother's inevitable outrage. I was operating purely on logistics, risk management, and consequence delivery. When you remove a malignant tumor, you do not mourn the loss of the diseased tissue. You celebrate the survival of the host. Trey and his family had acted like parasites feeding off my success while simultaneously trying to break my spirit. Tonight they were being surgically excised from my life. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. The countdown was ticking. Vance and his team were already on site. The smart locks were being wiped clean. The designer bags and expensive shoes were being tossed into cardboard boxes. The stage was being meticulously set for the greatest reality check Trey had ever experienced. He wanted to play the role of the undisputed alpha male. He was about to find out exactly how quickly an alpha becomes a stray when the real boss changes the locks. The velvet booth in the back of the upscale lounge offered the perfect vantage point. The ambient lighting was kept intentionally low, and the slow jazz music playing softly from the overhead speakers created an atmosphere of absolute tranquility. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, hostile environment I had just abandoned. I placed my smartphone on the polished mahogany table and leaned back against the plush seating. The high-definition screen was divided into a grid, displaying the live security feeds from every angle of my property. The resolution was sharp enough to capture the rustling leaves on the giant oak trees lining the driveway. I ordered a glass of aged bourbon neat and waited for the show to begin. It was exactly 7:45 when the headlights of Malik's oversized SUV pierced the growing dusk, sweeping across the manicured front lawn of my estate. Right behind his vehicle, Vivian's pristine Cadillac rolled smoothly onto the property. They had not stayed to enjoy the rest of their holiday cookout or wait for the fireworks. The desperate need to establish dominance and put me in my proper place had completely overridden their desire to celebrate the holiday. They had formed a unified caravan of self-righteousness traveling across the city with the singular purpose of staging a family intervention. They intended to corner me in my own home, surround me with their collective disapproval, and bully me into submitting to Jada. I watched intently as the vehicle doors opened on the surveillance feed. Trey stepped out first, adjusting the collar of his expensive polo shirt. He walked with that exaggerated rolling swagger he always adopted whenever he felt backed by a supportive audience. Jada climbed out of the passenger seat, trailing closely behind him. She was still clutching her supposedly ruined Dior bag, holding it against her chest like a shield of absolute victimhood. Vivian, Malik, and Harper followed, forming a tight phalanx of unwarranted entitlement. Harper was already waving her hands in animated conversation, probably drafting the exact psychological buzzwords she planned to hurl at me to ensure I felt sufficiently unhinged. They were treating my private residence like a courtroom, and they had enthusiastically appointed themselves the jury and the executioners. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the sharp burn anchor me to the present moment. Through the high-definition audio feed linked to the front porch camera, I could hear their conversation crystal clear. Trey was practically gloating to his brother about how quickly I was going to fold under the pressure. He loudly assured Malik that I just needed to blow off some steam, but that my sudden dramatic departure was nothing more than a desperate cry for his attention. He told his mother that by the time they walked through the front doors, I would already have my bags packed in a performative bluff, waiting for him to step in and beg me to stay so I could inevitably surrender. The sheer volume of his delusion was almost clinical to witness. He truly believed he possessed that kind of gravitational pull over my entire existence. They marched up the wide stone steps leading to the grand double doors of the mansion. Trey did not bother reaching into his pockets for a physical key. He never did because he loved the daily performance of modern luxury. He proudly extended his right index finger to the biometric smart lock that secured the main entrance. He pressed his finger against the illuminated glass scanner, fully expecting the familiar, satisfying mechanical click of the heavy deadbolt sliding open to welcome him home. Instead, the security panel flashed a stark, aggressive red light. A sharp automated buzz echoed across the quiet porch. Access denied. I watched a small frown crease Trey's forehead. He muttered something under his breath about the heavy summer humidity messing with the optical sensor. He wiped his index finger vigorously against the fabric of his shirt and pressed it against the scanner a second time, applying more physical force. The panel flared red again. A louder, sustained buzz sounded, access denied. Jada let out a loud, dramatic sigh, shifting her weight impatiently from one foot to the other. She loudly complained about the evening heat and the mosquitoes biting her ankles. She demanded her father just punch in the numerical override code so she could go inside and wash the sticky lemonade residue off her designer shoes. She whined that her feet were hurting and that I was probably inside right now, intentionally ignoring the doorbell just to be petty and vindictive. Trey puffed his chest out, trying to mask his growing frustration in front of his audience. He confidently punched in the 6-digit master code that he had used multiple times a day for the past 5 years. He hit the enter button with a firm, aggressive tap. The system flashed red 3 consecutive times and emitted a sharp warning tone indicating an invalid entry. The system was now temporarily locked for 1 minute due to multiple failed attempts. Vivian pushed her way to the front of the group, adjusting her silk shawl with an irritated huff. She demanded to know what was wrong with the door and why it was taking so long to get inside. She loudly complained that I had probably broken the expensive smart home system because I was acting too emotional and careless when I rushed inside. Harper chimed in, offering a patronizing theory that perhaps my negative energy had caused me to slam the door too hard, triggering a security lockdown protocol. Malik simply laughed, clapping Trey on the shoulder and telling him to stop playing around with the electronics because he wanted to get inside and catch the baseball highlights on the theater room television. None of them could comprehend the reality of the situation because their brains were simply not wired to process absolute defeat. They still firmly believed they were the main characters in a grand story that I was completely financing. They thought this was a minor technological inconvenience, rather than a deliberate tactical strike against their entire way of life. I watched the exact second the carefully constructed facade began to crack. Trey's shoulders dropped slightly, losing their arrogant posture. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, opening the proprietary smart home application that he used to control the interior lights, the climate control, and the security gates. He stared at his screen. The audio feed picked up his sharp intake of breath. The application was completely blank. A gray error box floated in the center of his screen, informing him that his user privileges had been permanently revoked by the primary administrator. He tapped the glass frantically, his thumb jabbing at the icons with mounting desperation. He refreshed the application. He force-closed the app and reopened it, hoping it was just a connectivity issue. Nothing changed. The digital kingdom he had proudly ruled over was officially denying his existence. His name had been wiped from the database. His access tokens were voided. The house did not recognize him as a resident, an authorized user, or even a welcome guest. He turned around to face his family, his confident swagger completely evaporating into the warm evening air. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated the rising panic taking hold in his eyes. He tried to maintain his composure, offering a shaky, unconvincing excuse about a major software update glitching the entire neighborhood network. He said he would need to call the security company to reset the router and gain access. But Vivian was already losing her patience with his excuses. She stepped past him and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, yanking it downward with all her might. The door did not yield a single millimeter. It stood as solid and immovable as a bank vault. I sat in my quiet booth miles away, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, and smiled at the glowing screen. The arrogance was bleeding out of them drop by drop. The storm they had demanded was finally here, and they were locked outside in the rain. The collision happened just as I was making my way past the poolside cabana, holding a heavy ceramic tray of glazed ribs in one hand and a freshly filled pitcher of strawberry lemonade in the other. I was walking slowly, making sure to announce my presence as I navigated the narrow pathway between the lounge chairs and the main dining table. Jada was standing with her back to me, showing off her phone screen to a group of her cousins. I saw her glance over her shoulder. I saw her eyes lock onto the pitcher in my hand. And in a move so deliberate it almost felt choreographed, she took a sudden sharp step backward, placing herself directly in my path. I tried to pivot, but the heavy tray threw off my balance. The ribs stayed secure, but the sudden movement caused the heavy glass pitcher to tip. A tidal wave of pink sticky lemonade cascaded over the edge, splashing directly onto the patio stone and perfectly coating the Christian Dior book tote resting at Jada's feet. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely theatrical. Jada let out a blood-curdling shriek that cut through the heavy bass of the R&B music playing from the outdoor speakers. She leaped away from the puddle, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically assaulted. "Look what she did," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "She threw it right at me. She ruined my bag. She did it on purpose because she hates me." The music was abruptly cut off. The low hum of family chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. 60 pairs of eyes turned to watch the spectacle. I stood there holding the now half-empty pitcher, my face completely impassive. I did not drop the tray. I did not gasp. I simply looked at Jada, who was currently forcing fake tears out of her eyes while gesturing wildly at the stained canvas tote bag. Before I could even open my mouth to state the obvious fact that she had intentionally stepped into my path, Vivian descended upon us like a hawk. My mother-in-law dropped her plate of food on a nearby table and rushed over, wrapping her arms protectively around her fully grown granddaughter. "Oh, my poor sweet baby," Vivian cooed, stroking Jada's hair before turning a venomous glare in my direction. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice echoing across the silent backyard. "You clumsy, bitter woman. You just cannot stand to see my granddaughter have nice things, can you? You have been jealous of her from the day you forced your way into this family." I took a slow, deep breath, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Vivian." I was walking behind her. She stepped backward directly into me. This was an accident, though a highly avoidable one if she had watched where she was going. "Do not you dare lie to me in my own backyard!" Vivian shouted, stepping closer and pointing her finger inches from my nose. We all know exactly what this is. This is exactly what happens when Trey brings someone from the bottom up to Buckhead. You can buy the expensive suits, and you can start a little business, but you cannot buy class. You have zero grace and zero home training. You are nothing but a jealous outsider trying to ruin a beautiful family gathering because you do not know how to act around people of substance. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the humid air. The woman calling me classless was currently shouting at the top of her lungs over spilled juice, while I, the supposed outsider, remained completely silent and composed. I glanced around the yard. My husband's cousins, aunts, and uncles were all watching, some shaking their heads in disapproval of me, others whispering behind their hands. Not a single person stepped forward to ask what actually happened. They had already decided on the narrative. I was the evil stepmother and Jada was the innocent victim. Then the crowd parted, and Trey marched into the center of the patio. His jaw was clenched tight and his chest was puffed out. He was in full performance mode, desperate to prove his authority in front of his audience. He looked at the spilled lemonade, then at his weeping daughter, and finally at his furious mother. He did not look at me, not really. He did not see his wife of 5 years, the woman who had supported him through 3 career transitions and funded his entire lifestyle. He only saw a threat to his public image. "What the hell is going on here?" Trey demanded, his voice artificially deep and booming. "Dad, she ruined my Dior bag," Jada sobbed, burying her face in Vivian's shoulder. "The one you bought me for making the dean's list?" She poured a whole pitcher of sticky juice on it because I asked her to move the food away from my things. "She is crazy." Trey turned to me, his eyes flashing with a harsh, unforgiving light. I waited for him to ask for my side of the story. I waited for the man who promised to protect and honor me to show even a fraction of loyalty. Instead, he puffed his chest out further, stepping into my personal space to physically intimidate me. "What is wrong with you, Trey?" hissed, his voice loud enough for the front row of relatives to hear every word. "I bring you to my mother's house for a peaceful holiday, and you humiliate my daughter in front of my entire family. Over a bag." "Trey," I said, keeping my tone quiet and steady. "Your daughter backed into me. I did not throw anything. Check your security cameras if you want proof." "I do not want to hear your damn excuses," Trey barked. cutting me off completely. He pointed to the sticky puddle on the stone patio. That bag cost me $3,000. You are going to get down there right now, clean up that mess, wipe that bag off, and apologize to my daughter. I stared at him. For a moment, the backyard seemed to hold its breath. Even Vivian stopped her dramatic comforting to watch my reaction. Trey was actually demanding that I, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm, drop to my knees in front of 60 people to scrub the patio and beg forgiveness from a spoiled 20-year-old. He was demanding total submission, a public execution of my dignity, just so he could feel like a king in his mother's backyard. You want me to kneel? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. I want you to fix what you broke, Trey said, crossing his arms over his chest. You disrespected my child in my mother's house. So yes, you are going to get down there, wipe that bag clean, and look Jada in the eye and say, you are sorry. If you cannot do that, if you cannot show some basic respect for my family, then you can get out. The ultimatum was laid out bare and ugly for everyone to see. Kneel or leave, submit or be cast out. He thought he was backing me into a corner. He thought because I had always kept the peace, I would swallow my pride one more time to avoid a public scandal. He calculated that my desire to save our marriage was stronger than my self-respect. It was the most fatal miscalculation he had ever made in his entire life. As I looked at my husband standing there, so proud of his momentary dominance, my analytical mind took over completely. The hurt vanished. The frustration evaporated. All that remained was absolute crystalline clarity. I looked at the Dior bag sitting in the puddle. I remembered the exact day I transferred the funds into Trey's account so he could pretend to buy it for her. I looked at the luxury watch on his wrist, the one I bought him for his 40th birthday. I looked at the confident sneer on Jada's face and the triumphant glare from Vivian. They truly believed they had won. They had no idea that this single moment was the catalyst that would unravel their entire existence. As Vivian yanked on the immovable brass handle, the remote command I had queued up on my iPad successfully executed. The property's high-security perimeter floodlights activated simultaneously. Blinding pure white LED beams flooded the entire front yard, erasing the evening shadows and illuminating the sprawling manicured lawn with the intensity of a stadium stage. The sudden burst of light caused the entire group to flinch and shield their eyes. But as their vision adjusted, the collective gasp that erupted from the front porch was absolute music to my ears. Sitting perfectly aligned on the pristine emerald green sod just beyond the edge of the circular driveway was a fortress of heavy-duty moving boxes. My private security team had executed Protocol 404 with military precision. Dozens of reinforced cardboard boxes and clear plastic storage bins were stacked in immaculate rows. It was not a chaotic dumping of belongings. It was a sterile, calculated exhibition of their eviction. Jada was the first to break the stunned silence. She let out a piercing, horrified scream and abandoned her ruined Dior bag on the porch, sprinting down the stone steps toward the lawn. Through the high-definition camera feed, I watched her drop to her knees in the damp grass, tearing the lid off one of the clear plastic bins. Inside, her entire collection of designer shoes was packed away. Every pair of Christian Louboutins, every limited edition sneaker, every expensive accessory she had flaunted to her sorority sisters, all sitting out in the open air. My clothes, she shrieked, her voice cracking with genuine panic. Dad, she packed up all my clothes. My room is out here. Trey stood frozen on the top step, his mouth slightly open, his alpha male persona crumbling into dust. Right next to Jada's bins sat his entire identity, boxed up and banished from the kingdom. His custom-tailored suits hung neatly on portable garment racks, completely exposed to the humid Georgia night. His expensive golf clubs, his imported cologne collection, and his prized mahogany watch case containing timepieces subsidized by my corporate accounts were all resting on the grass. The visual was devastating. Everything that made him feel powerful was sitting on the lawn like items at a neighborhood yard sale. Vivian clutched her silk shawl tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with shock. She looked around nervously, scanning the street to see if any of her wealthy church friends or neighborhood gossips were driving past to witness her golden son's public humiliation. Malik and Harper stood completely paralyzed at the base of the steps, the reality of my retaliation finally dawning on them. Harper was not offering any radical empathy or therapy buzzwords now. She was staring at the boxes in absolute terror, realizing that the woman she had just patronized had the power to dismantle a life in under 3 hours. Trey finally snapped out of his paralysis, his face contorted with a ferocious, desperate rage. He stormed back up the porch steps, marching aggressively toward the front door, ready to kick the heavy wood in a futile display of brute force. But as he raised his fist, the bright porch lights revealed something he had completely missed in the shadows just moments before. Taped directly to the center of the custom frosted glass of the double doors was a thick plastic sleeve containing a stack of crisp white legal documents. Trey snatched the sleeve off the glass, ripping the papers out with trembling hands. I zoomed the camera in on his face, watching the exact second his brain tried to process the heavy legal jargon printed on the first page. It was a formal notice to quit and evict printed on the official letterhead of Aegis Strategic Investments, LLC. The document explicitly stated that his status as a tenant at will had been immediately and permanently revoked by the property management. It warned that any attempt to re-enter the premises would be treated as criminal trespassing and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. "What is this garbage?" Trey yelled, waving the paper at the security camera mounted above the door. "I know you are watching, Zuri. You cannot kick me out of my own house. I am your husband. This is community property." He flipped to the second page, and his voice abruptly died in his throat. The second document was not from my corporate attorney. It was stamped and signed by a judge from the Fulton County Superior Court. It was an emergency asset freeze order. The legal mandate explicitly prohibited the removal, transfer, or liquidation of any assets. More importantly, it detailed the immediate freezing of all joint banking accounts and line of credit access, pending a full forensic financial audit regarding the embezzlement of corporate funds. Malik stepped up onto the porch and leaned over his brother's shoulder to read the glowing white pages. Unlike Trey, Malik actually ran a business and understood the severity of legal terminology. I watched Malik's eyes dart across the paragraphs, his expression shifting from supportive outrage to genuine legal panic. Trey, Malik said, his voice low and tight with anxiety. "This is a court order. She got a judge to sign an asset freeze. And this eviction notice, it says, the house is owned by an LLC. Bro, whose name is on the deed to this house." "It is our house," Trey stammered, pointing wildly at the brick pillars. "I am on the insurance. We live here." Malik snatched the paper from his brother's hand, scanning the ownership details. "No, Trey, listen to me," Malik said urgently, shaking the document. "You are listed as an occupant. Zuri's holding company owns the property outright. She does not need a divorce decree to kick you out. She just executed a commercial eviction. You have absolutely no legal right to step foot inside that door." The words hit Trey like a physical blow. The illusion he had sold to his mother, his brother, his daughter, and his friends was completely shattered in front of all of them. He could no longer pretend he was the master of the estate. He had been exposed as nothing more than a glorified guest who had just worn out his welcome. Down on the lawn, Jada was sobbing hysterically, pulling her designer clothes out of the boxes and demanding that someone open the gate so she could carry them back to her room. Vivian was pacing back and forth on the driveway, aggressively dialing my phone number over and over again. My phone sat silently on the mahogany table in the lounge, automatically routing her calls directly to voicemail. She wanted to scream at me. She wanted to demand respect. She wanted to use her authority as the matriarch to force me to open the doors and apologize to her son. But there was no one to scream at. There was no argument to be won. I had removed myself from the equation entirely, leaving them to fight against cold, hard legal reality. I signaled the bartender for a refill of my bourbon, watching the silent, chaotic ballet play out on my screen. Trey was pacing the porch, rubbing his hands over his face, the sheer panic of his financial ruin finally taking hold. Without access to those credit cards, he had no way to pay for a hotel suite large enough to house his daughter and his belongings. Without the joint checking account, he could not even hire a moving truck to transport the boxes off the lawn. He was a king without a castle, without a treasury, and suddenly without his pride. He looked up directly into the lens of the porch camera. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of rage and a newfound profound terror. He raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger at the lens, but he did not shout. He realized that screaming would not unlock the doors. He realized that the woman he had publicly humiliated was currently pulling the strings of his entire existence. The balance of power had shifted completely, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the avalanche crashing down upon him. Trey's initial shock quickly mutated into a blinding, unpredictable rage. He could not comprehend the reality of his powerlessness, so he resorted to the only tool he had left, which was brute force. He lunged at the custom-frosted glass of the double doors, slamming his heavy fists against the reinforced panes. The dull thuds echoed across the manicured lawn, disrupting the peaceful quiet of the gated community. He started shouting my name, demanding that I stop playing games and open the door immediately. He threatened to break a window. He threatened to drag me out into the street. He performed a spectacular display of toxic masculinity, completely unaware that his violent tantrum was being recorded in high definition by the security cameras capturing every single aggressive movement for future court proceedings. When banging on the door yielded absolutely no results, Trey pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking with pure adrenaline and fury as he dialed emergency services. He paced the length of the porch, running his hand over his head, putting on his best performance of a distressed but respectable citizen. He told the dispatcher that his erratic wife had suffered a mental breakdown, illegally changed the locks on their marital home, and thrown all of his terrified daughter's belongings into the yard. He demanded immediate police intervention, claiming this was an unlawful self-help eviction, and insisting that I needed to be arrested on the spot. He hung up the phone and looked down at his brother Malik with a triumphant, vindictive smirk. He genuinely believed that the police were his personal enforcers who would show up, break down the doors, and force me to submit to his authority. Vivian, who was standing near the boxes of Jada's clothes, clutched her pearl necklace and nodded in fervent agreement. She loudly declared that I was finally going to be put in handcuffs and taught a lesson about respecting my betters. Jada sniffled, wiping her ruined makeup and glaring at the house while Harper stood in the background, quietly distancing herself from the impending chaos. While they waited for the authorities to arrive, I casually finished the last drop of bourbon in my glass at the lounge. I signaled the waiter, paid the tab, and walked out to the parking lot where my lead attorney Marcus was already waiting in his vehicle. We drove back to my estate in tandem. I bypassed the main gates, entirely utilizing the private secure underground access tunnel that I had built for my high-profile clients, a feature Trey had no code to enter. We parked in the subterranean garage and took the private elevator directly into the main foyer of the mansion just as the wailing sirens pierced the quiet evening air. Two police cruisers with flashing red and blue lights pulled aggressively into the circular driveway, casting harsh shadows across the fortress of cardboard boxes sitting on the lawn. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they assessed the chaotic scene. Trey immediately rushed down the porch steps to greet them, playing the role of the aggrieved property owner perfectly. He pointed wildly at the house and then at the boxes on the grass. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," he said, using his deepest, most authoritative corporate voice. "My wife has completely lost her mind. We stepped out for a family holiday gathering and she came back early, illegally locked us out of our own home and dumped my daughter's personal property in the dirt. This is an illegal lockout. I want her removed from the premises and I want her arrested for malicious destruction of property right now." The lead officer, a tall, stern-looking man with a graying mustache, held up a hand to pause Trey's frantic tirade. "Calm down, sir," the officer commanded. "We need to get both sides of the story before anyone is put in handcuffs. Who exactly is inside the residence?" Right on cue, I pressed the button on the smart panel next to the entryway. The heavy brass deadbolts clicked loudly in unison. The massive double doors swung open outward, revealing me standing perfectly composed on the portico. I was not crying. I was not frantic. I looked exactly like a woman who owned the ground I was standing on. Marcus stepped out right beside me, holding a sleek leather briefcase and adjusting his tailored suit jacket. The officers looked up at us, slightly taken aback by my absolute tranquility in the face of such a chaotic scene. "Ma'am, are you the wife?" the lead officer asked, stepping toward the porch. "Your husband here claims you have illegally changed the locks and evicted him without due process." I smiled politely, placing my hands clasped in front of me. "Officers, I apologize for bringing you out here on a holiday evening," I said, my voice smooth and projecting clearly across the lawn. "However, this man is not a homeowner. He does not have a single drop of equity in this estate. He is a former tenant whose occupancy rights have been legally and permanently terminated. The man standing beside me is my lead corporate counsel, Marcus, and he has all the documentation you need to verify this." Trey let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "She is lying," he yelled, pointing at me. "We have been married for 5 years. This is our marital home. She cannot just kick me out without a court order. Arrest her." Marcus did not flinch. He calmly unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. He stepped down one stair and handed the paperwork directly to the lead officer. "Officer, this property is not a marital asset," Marcus explained in a calm, measured tone. "It is entirely owned by Aegis Strategic Investments, LLC. My client is the sole managing member of that holding company. The individual making these noise complaints signed a commercial residential occupancy agreement 5 years ago, clearly establishing him as a tenant at will. He has no deed, no title, and no property rights whatsoever. Furthermore, you will see a court-stamped asset freeze order from the Fulton County Superior Court attached to that file prohibiting him from entering the premises to protect valuable corporate assets." The officer turned his flashlight onto the documents, carefully reviewing the property deed, the LLC incorporation papers, and the judicial signature on the asset freeze. Trey's arrogant smile began to falter as he watched the officer's face shift from skeptical to deadly serious. "That does not matter," Trey stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Even if I am a tenant, you cannot just change the locks. You need to give 30 days notice by law. This is a self-help eviction and it is illegal. Tell her she broke the law." I stepped forward, leaning against the doorframe, looking down at my husband with absolute predatory satisfaction. "Actually, Trey, exactly 30 days ago, I sent a formal notice of lease termination to both your primary personal email and your corporate work address." Trey froze. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I never got any notice. You are lying." I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, tapping the screen twice. "I sent it at exactly 9:15 in the morning on a Tuesday," I said, projecting my voice so his entire family could hear his impending humiliation. "Because my firm utilizes advanced enterprise software, I have the digital read receipts right here. You opened the email at 9:18. But since the subject line read Aegis LLC Annual Occupancy and Asset Reallocation Notice, you simply skimmed the first line, assumed it was boring tax optimization paperwork, and archived it without reading the attachment." I paused, letting the weight of his own arrogance crush the remaining oxygen out of his lungs. "You were too busy scrolling through luxury car listings to read the legal documents sent to your inbox. Your refusal to read a legally binding notice does not somehow invalidate its legal execution. You were served, Trey. The 30 days expired at 5 o'clock today." Marcus handed a secondary sheet of paper to the officer. "The digital logs and IP address tracking, confirming the email was opened and read on his device, are right there, officer. Everything was executed strictly by the book. My client even had his personal belongings carefully packed by a bonded and insured security team to ensure nothing was damaged." The lead officer reviewed the digital logs and handed the entire stack of paperwork back to Marcus. The officer turned around to face Trey, and his demeanor had completely shifted from investigating a domestic dispute to enforcing a strict legal boundary. He rested his hand on his duty belt and stepped directly into Trey's personal space. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying a hard, unyielding authority, "this is entirely a civil matter, and everything presented to me appears to be strictly legal and thoroughly documented by the property owner. You have no ownership rights to this estate. Your tenancy has been properly revoked with the required notice. But I have nowhere to go. Trey pleaded, the desperation finally cracking his voice. My clothes are on the grass. You cannot just leave me out here. I highly suggest you gather your belongings and find a hotel for the night. The officer responded firmly, completely unmoved by the dramatic performance. Because as of right now, you are no longer a resident. In fact, since your permission to be on this property has been officially revoked by the legal owner, you are currently trespassing. I need you to step back from these doors immediately and move your family off this driveway before I am forced to cite you for disturbing the peace. The command echoed across the quiet neighborhood. The flashing blue lights painted Trey's face in harsh alternating colors, revealing a man whose entire universe had just been brutally, systematically dismantled. He had called the police, hoping to watch me be dragged away in handcuffs. Instead, he was being ordered off his own front lawn, threatened with a trespassing charge, while the woman he had tried to humiliate stood safely behind the impregnable walls of her castle. The silence that followed the police officer's command was thick and suffocating. Trey stood absolutely paralyzed at the base of the porch steps, with the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off his sweating forehead. He had run completely out of moves, but his spoiled daughter had not yet grasped the gravity of the legal wall they had just crashed into. Jada pushed past her Uncle Malik and stomped toward the front of the group, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice shrill and echoing loudly through the humid night air. "You cannot do this!" she screamed. "My jewelry is still in my bedroom. My laptop is in there. My diamond necklace that my dad bought me for my birthday is sitting on my vanity. You are not keeping my things, you psycho. Tell them, Dad. Tell the police to arrest her for stealing my jewelry." I looked down at her with absolute pity. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned to the lead officer. "Officer, every single piece of personal property belonging to this young woman has been carefully packed into those clear plastic bins on the lawn," I explained smoothly. "Nothing of hers remains inside my home. If she is referring to the diamond necklace, she might want to check the small velvet box inside bin number 4. Though she should probably know that the diamonds are cubic zirconia, and the receipt is in her father's name from a discount mall jeweler. I suppose he forgot to mention that detail when he presented it to her as a high-end luxury piece." Jada gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. She spun around to look at her father, expecting him to furiously deny the accusation. Trey simply looked away, his jaw clenched tight, unable to maintain eye contact with his precious daughter. The illusion of his boundless wealth was unraveling so fast he could not even attempt to patch the holes. "I want my things!" Jada shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. She tried to rush the porch steps, but the secondary police officer immediately stepped into her path, holding his hand up to block her advance. "Miss, you need to step back and remain on the grass," the officer warned her firmly. "The property owner has made it clear you are trespassing. Gather your boxes and vacate the premises." Jada stomped her foot on the pavement, acting exactly like a toddler denied a toy in a department store. "I am not leaving," she yelled. "I am taking my car, and I am leaving when I want to." She turned aggressively toward the driveway, pointing to the gleaming pearl-white Mercedes-Benz C-Class, sitting perfectly parked under the glow of the street lamp. "I am packing my bags into my car right now." Right on cue, a deep, vibrating rumble echoed down the quiet suburban street. The heavy, grinding sound of a massive diesel engine cut through Jada's tantrum. Everyone on the lawn turned their heads toward the main road. The sweeping beam of bright amber strobe lights washed over the pristine landscaping, casting long, rotating shadows across the brick facade of the mansion. A massive commercial flatbed tow truck turned wide into the circular driveway, the hydraulic brakes hissing sharply as the massive vehicle pulled to a halt directly in front of my property. Jada stopped screaming. Her mouth hung open in silent confusion as she watched the tow truck driver shift gears and begin backing the heavy flatbed directly toward her beloved Mercedes. The warning backup beeps echoed rhythmically across the yard, a slow, steady countdown to her absolute ruin. "What is he doing?" Jada shrieked, her panic spiking to a fever pitch. "Hey, stop that! You are going to hit my car! Dad, tell him to stop!" Trey finally snapped out of his paralysis. He charged across the lawn, marching aggressively toward the tow truck driver who had just hopped out of the cab. The driver was a towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a heavy canvas work jacket and carrying a rugged digital tablet. He did not look intimidated by Trey in the slightest. "Hey," Trey barked, stepping right up to the driver. "What the hell do you think you are doing? You need to back that rig up right now. That is my daughter's vehicle." The tow truck driver barely glanced at Trey. He tapped his screen, verifying the license plate against his digital manifest. "I have a repossession order for a white Mercedes-Benz C-Class associated with this address." The driver said, his voice bored and entirely mechanical. "The VIN matches. I am taking the vehicle." "Step away from the hook, sir." "Repossession." Trey yelled, his voice cracking in disbelief. "That is impossible. The car is fully financed. I make the payments on that vehicle." The driver let out a short, dry laugh. "Buddy, I do not know what you do, but the bank says the loan is in default. The primary guarantor authorized a voluntary surrender of the collateral this afternoon. I am just here to collect the metal. If you have a problem, you can call the bank on Monday morning. Now, back away before I ask these police officers to remove you for interfering with illegal recovery." Trey froze, entirely emasculated in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. He slowly turned his head to look back at the porch where I was still standing comfortably next to Marcus. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the porch railing, making sure my voice carried clearly over the rumble of the diesel engine. "The loan was entirely under my name, Trey," I announced. "My pristine credit score secured that vehicle. The monthly payments were automatically drafted from my business accounts. But since I permanently froze your access to those accounts today, the loan lacked a valid funding source. I am not in the business of maintaining liabilities for individuals who disrespect me in my own home." At exactly 5 o'clock today, I contacted the financing institution and authorized an immediate voluntary surrender of the asset to protect my corporate credit rating. "No!" Jada screamed, a raw, visceral sound of pure devastation. "No, no, no, you cannot take my car. Everyone at school knows my car. You cannot do this to me." She ran toward the Mercedes, desperately throwing her body against the driver's side door, as if her physical presence could somehow anchor the 2-ton vehicle to the driveway. The tow truck driver simply sighed, hit a lever on his control panel, and the heavy steel cables began to whine. The hydraulic winch engaged, dragging the front tires of the luxury sedan onto the tilted metal ramp with a harsh scraping sound. Jada dropped to her knees on the damp grass, her hands covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. The custom designer dress she had worn so proudly to the barbecue was now stained with dirt and wet earth. Her perfect, carefully curated aesthetic was completely destroyed. The ultimate symbol of her unearned status, the car she used to secure her position in her elite college sorority, was being hoisted into the air like a piece of discarded trash. She had nothing left. Her clothes were in plastic bins on the lawn. Her jewelry was exposed as fake. Her luxury car was being repossessed by a bank. She had been stripped bare of every single materialistic shield she possessed. Trey stood over his weeping daughter, completely incapable of offering her any comfort. He could not fix this. He could not pull out a credit card to make the problem go away because he did not have a single dollar to his name. He had promised her the world, but he had financed it with another woman's money. Now the bill had finally come due and he was spiritually and financially bankrupt. I looked past the broken father and daughter and locked eyes with Vivian. My mother-in-law was standing rigidly by her Cadillac, holding her purse against her chest like a life preserver. The woman who had loudly declared that I lacked class and home training was now watching her golden son and her precious granddaughter being publicly humiliated and legally evicted while 2 police cruisers monitored the scene. She was absolutely mortified. The heavy realization that her wealthy church friends and the neighborhood association would undoubtedly hear about this spectacular display of failure was completely paralyzing her. She knew the gossip would be relentless. She knew her family's reputation in Buckhead was permanently ruined. Malik and Harper had retreated entirely, standing silently in the shadows near their SUV. Harper was no longer offering unsolicited advice about generational trauma or radical empathy. She was witnessing the catastrophic danger of crossing my boundaries, and she was visibly terrified. She realized that the woman she had patronized earlier that morning possessed the power and the ruthless precision to systematically obliterate a life in a matter of hours. The tow truck secured the Mercedes, the heavy chains clanking loudly into place. The driver climbed back into his cab, shifted the massive truck into gear, and slowly pulled out of the driveway. The amber strobe lights faded down the street, taking Jada's last remaining shred of dignity away into the dark night. I turned to the lead police officer who was watching the family on the lawn with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet pity. "Officer," I said, my tone indicating that the evening's business was officially concluded. "The exterior floodlights operate on a strict conservation timer. They will automatically shut down in exactly 5 minutes. I highly suggest you advise these trespassers to load their cardboard boxes into their remaining vehicles before they are left packing in pitch darkness." The officer tipped his hat to me. "Understood, ma'am. Have a good evening." I did not say goodbye to Trey. I did not offer a parting word to Vivian or Jada. I simply turned my back on the wreckage they had brought upon themselves and walked inside my magnificent home. Marcus stepped in right behind me, the heavy custom doors swinging shut on their perfectly oiled hinges. The heavy brass deadbolts engaged with a loud resounding click, permanently locking the past outside in the dark where it belonged. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, offering a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. My crisis management firm occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass high-rise in Midtown. I sat behind my custom mahogany desk, sipping a perfectly brewed matcha tea and reviewing the digital reports from Vance. The overnight operation had been a complete success. Trey and Jada had eventually packed their cardboard boxes into Malik's SUV and retreated into the night. The locks were secured, the asset freeze was fully active, and my personal life was finally operating with the same ruthless efficiency as my corporate contracts. The intercom on my desk buzzed sharply, breaking the quiet hum of the air conditioning. My executive assistant, Sarah, sounded slightly out of breath. She informed me that my brother-in-law and his wife were currently in the reception area demanding to see me immediately. They were refusing to leave and threatening to cause a public scene if they were not granted access. I smiled, setting my teacup down on the marble coaster. I pressed the intercom button and told Sarah to send them right in. In my industry, you never avoid a confrontation when you hold all the leverage. You invite the hostile party into your territory, let them expend their energy, and then you dismantle their arguments on your home turf. The heavy glass door to my office swung open with aggressive force. Malik marched in first, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt that suggested he had not slept well on the inflatable mattress he likely had to share with his suddenly homeless brother. But Malik was not the primary threat. He was merely the emotional bodyguard for his wife. Harper strode into my office right behind him, carrying an oversized organic canvas tote bag and wearing an expression of profound manufactured disappointment. She was dressed in her signature bohemian chic aesthetic, a deliberate choice to make her look approachable and grounded despite her massive generational wealth. She did not wait for an invitation to sit. She immediately took the leather guest chair across from my desk, crossing her legs and leaning forward with her hands clasped tightly together. She looked around my immaculate office, taking in the industry awards on the walls and the sweeping city views with a distinct flash of resentment. Harper always hated the fact that a black woman she secretly viewed as unrefined possessed a level of corporate power she could never achieve with her boutique charity foundation. She saw herself as the ultimate savior figure in this family, and my independence completely threatened her narrative. Zuri, Harper began, her voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing therapy speak. "We need to have a very serious adult conversation about the dangerous path you chose to walk down last night. What you did to Trey was not just a legal maneuver. It was an act of profound cultural violence." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my fingertips together. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer an explanation. I simply let the silence stretch out, forcing Harper to fill the void with her own inflated sense of superiority. "You have to understand the optics of your actions," Harper continued, leaning further over my desk, her eyes wide with performative concern. You are a successful, educated woman of color. You understand the systemic pressures facing Black men in America today. Trey is out there trying to navigate a society that constantly attempts to strip him of his dignity and his power. As his wife, you are supposed to be his sanctuary. Instead, you used your financial privilege to completely emasculate him in front of his entire family and the local authorities. You reduced him to a statistic. You kicked a Black man out of his own home and threw his daughter's belongings into the dirt. Malik nodded emphatically, crossing his arms over his chest. He fully supported his white wife lecturing a Black woman about the Black male experience. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance, but they were completely blind to their own absurdity. Malik added that I had humiliated the family name and that Trey was currently sitting in their cramped guest room having a complete mental breakdown because I had stripped away his pride over a spilled cup of lemonade. I let Malik finish his sentence before returning my gaze exclusively to Harper. She was practically glowing with self-righteous satisfaction. She genuinely believed she was delivering a profound sociological lesson. She thought she was the enlightened ally swooping in to save her poor, disadvantaged brother-in-law from his cruel, vindictive wife. She used words like emasculate and systemic pressure as weapons to guilt-trip me into submitting to a man who had been secretly stealing from my business accounts. It is deeply problematic. Harper pressed on, sensing my silence as a sign of weakness. You are perpetuating the exact same toxic matriarchal dominance that fractures families in your community. You need to drop this ridiculous eviction nonsense called a bank, to release the hold on the accounts and apologize to Trey. If you do not, you are essentially participating in the destruction of a Black family unit, and as an ally, I simply cannot stand by and watch you do that to him. The sheer audacity of her monologue was breathtaking. She sat in my office built by my sweat equity and demanded that I continue financing a parasite to protect his fragile masculinity. She wanted me to endure financial abuse, disrespect, and public humiliation simply to maintain a socio-political narrative that made her feel comfortable in her role as the family savior. She was asking me to shrink my entire existence so that Trey could continue playing dress-up with my money. I kept my face perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the searing contempt boiling in my veins. When you are dealing with a narcissist wrapping themselves in the flag of social justice, you do not argue with their ideology. You attack their infrastructure. I reached out and gently closed the laptop sitting on my desk. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I walked around the massive mahogany desk and leaned against the edge, crossing my arms, as I looked down at Harper and Malik. They had marched into my territory, expecting a debate about morality. They had no idea they had just walked onto a financial minefield. They thought they came here to save Trey, but they were about to realize they could not even save themselves. I let the silence hang in the air for a few more seconds, letting her words completely lose their momentum. I slowly raised my hand and began to tap my index finger gently against the polished mahogany wood of my desk. The rhythmic ticking sound was the only noise in the room, a slow, steady countdown before the explosion. I looked directly at Harper, watching the carefully practiced defensive walls she had built around her ego begin to twitch. "You have a beautiful way with words, Harper," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chillingly conversational tone. "You almost sound like you actually believe the garbage coming out of your mouth. But let us stop the performance right now. The curtains are down. There are no cameras here. There are no wealthy donors to impress. There is just you, me, and the absolute fraud you live every single day." Harper's practiced expression of maternal concern instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp defensive glare. "Zuri, that is an incredibly hostile and reductive thing to say," she hissed, her soothing therapy voice completely slipping away. "I have dedicated my entire life to advocacy and community empowerment. I came here out of love for this family. You came here because you are a narcissist who is deeply addicted to her own moral superiority," I countered, leaning forward, resting my weight on my palms. "You stand in my office lecturing me about the Black family unit and systemic pressures. But the truth is, you do not care about Trey. You do not care about Malik, and you certainly do not care about Vivian. You despise this family. You have always looked down on them from your pristine white tower in Connecticut. You did not marry Malik because you loved his culture or respected his heritage. You married him because he was the perfect exotic accessory for your progressive brand. He is your ultimate charity project. Malik shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between his wife and me. His jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, the heavy weight of my words beginning to chip away at his denial. You love playing the enlightened savior, Harper. I continued, my voice remaining completely flat and unyielding. It allows you to look down on everyone else while pretending to lift them up. You think I do not know about the private group chats you maintain with your childhood friends from back home. I run a data-driven crisis management firm, Harper. I handle corporate espionage for a living. Do you honestly think I would allow a woman like you into my inner circle without thoroughly auditing your digital footprint? I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a crisp manila folder, dropping it flat onto the mahogany wood. I did not open it. I just let it sit there right in front of her like a loaded weapon. Inside that folder are the verified transcripts of your digital conversations over the past 2 years, Harper, I said. I have the exact messages where you called Vivian an uneducated, overbearing matriarch whose cooking was greasy and whose house lacked taste. I have the screenshots of you joking about Trey's middle management career, calling him a cliché alpha male with zero financial intelligence and a massive fragile ego. Harper's face transitioned from angry crimson to a stark, ghostly white. She stared at the folder, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the absolute terror of her exposure paralyzed her vocal cords. You sit at Vivian's Sunday dinners, smiling and nodding, eating her food and hugging her grandchildren while secretly collecting data to write your upcoming book about navigating urban family structures, I said. You use this family as tokens to burnish your social credentials. You do not want Trey to succeed. You never wanted him to find his footing. You wanted him to stay broke and dependent on your husband's failing business because it allowed you to play the benevolent white sister-in-law who swoops in with a temporary loan and a lecture on systemic struggle. You need their inadequacy to validate your own superiority. If Trey is successful, if I am successful, your savior complex has absolutely no value. Malik turned his head slowly to look at his wife. The blind loyalty that had defined him for 5 years was fracturing in real time. Harper. He muttered, his voice low and cracking with a dangerous mixture of shock and anger. Is this true? Did you really say those things about my mother? Did you call my family a research project? Malik, she is manipulating you, Harper stammered, her hands flying up in a frantic wave of damage control. She is using classic corporate deflection tactics to avoid taking responsibility for her tarantula-like behavior last night. She is trying to divide our home because her own marriage is a failure. Do not listen to her. I am not dividing anything. Harper, I said calmly, straightening my posture and looking down at her. I am just revealing the fractures that you created. You walked into my office today thinking you could dictate terms to me. You thought you could weaponize the language of my own people's struggle to guilt-trip me into submission. You thought your progressive vocabulary would make me second-guess my bank statements, open my gates, and allow Trey back into my home to continue bleeding me dry. I leaned closer, making sure my eyes locked onto hers with absolute finality. But you forgot the most basic rule of risk assessment, Harper. Never bring a lecture to a knife fight. You are a tourist in our world, using our pain as content for your social media feed. I am a woman who built an empire out of concrete and survival. You do not possess the capacity to manipulate me, and you certainly do not possess the infrastructure to survive what I am about to do next. I shifted my gaze entirely away from Harper's trembling form and locked eyes directly with Malik. He had been standing aggressively near the door, trying to project an aura of masculine authority, but his posture was already beginning to collapse under the weight of his wife's exposure. He opened his mouth, attempting to salvage whatever remaining dignity he thought he possessed in my office. Look, Zuri, Malik said, raising a hand and trying to lower his voice to a reasonable octave. Whatever personal issues you have with Harper right now, we can put those aside. I did not come here to discuss my wife or her private text messages. I came here to talk about my brother. Trey is family. You cannot just throw him out on the street like garbage. You need to undo whatever legal maneuvering you pulled last night and restore his access to the accounts so we can handle this like adults. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, calculating smile of a predator watching its prey willingly step onto a trapdoor. Your blind loyalty to your brother is truly fascinating, Malik, I said, leaning back in my chair and resting my hands on the armrests. You will march into my corporate headquarters, ready to wage war on his behalf, completely oblivious to the fact that your own house is built on a foundation of sand. It is a profound tragedy that your business acumen has never managed to match your misplaced family devotion. Malik narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. What are you talking about? He demanded. Leave my business out of this. My company has nothing to do with Trey's marital problems. Your company has absolutely everything to do with me, I corrected him smoothly. Let us take a brief trip down memory lane, Malik. 2 years ago, your supply chain logistics startup was completely underwater. You were bleeding capital your initial investors had backed out, and you were exactly 3 weeks away from filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You came to my house begging Trey for a loan to keep the lights on. Trey naturally played the big shot and promised he would secure the funds for you. Malik puffed his chest out defensively. Trey came through for me. He found an anonymous venture capital group willing to inject a massive seed round to keep my operations running. That was private equity, Zuri. It had nothing to do with you or your public relations firm. I let out a soft, dry laugh that echoed through the quiet office. Malik, do you honestly believe your brother possesses the financial literacy or the high-level networking contacts required to secure a private equity buyout for a failing startup? Trey does not even know how to balance a standard checkbook without triggering an overdraft fee. I opened my desk drawer for the second time and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. I placed it on the desk and slid it forward. That anonymous venture capital group was called Vanguard Seed Initiatives, I stated, watching his eyes track the movement of the paper. They provided the bridge loan, the operational capital, and the line of credit that has kept your company artificially afloat for 24 months. They did not invest in your business because your financial projections were promising, Malik. Your business model is a complete disaster. They invested because the sole managing director of Vanguard Seed Initiatives instructed them to issue the funds. Malik stared at the paper from across the desk, but he did not step forward to read it. The blood was visibly draining from his face as the terrifying reality of my words began to penetrate his stubborn skull. I am the managing director of Vanguard Seed Initiatives, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am your anonymous angel investor, Malik. I did not fund your company because I believed in your vision. I funded your company because I was tired of you coming to my house and begging my husband for money. Every time Trey promised to help you, he was actually pulling from my accounts. It was simply more cost-effective for me to subsidize your failing business through a corporate entity than to deal with the constant financial drain on my personal assets. No, Malik stammered, taking a step backward. That is impossible. The board of directors, we just approved the next round of funding last week. The funds are scheduled to be released to payroll on Friday. Not anymore, I replied, picking up a sleek silver fountain pen from my desk and turning it over in my hands. You see, Malik, when you marched into my office today demanding that I continue to finance your brother's fraudulent lifestyle, you proved that you are a massive liability. I do not maintain liabilities in my investment portfolio. So at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I contacted the legal team at Vanguard. I executed my executive privilege as the majority shareholder. I officially canceled the upcoming funding round, and I signed the legal orders to immediately call in the entirety of the bridge loan. The silence that fell over my office was absolute and deafening. I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic through the thick glass windows, but inside the room the air was perfectly still. You what? Malik whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched register of pure panic. Zuri, you cannot do that. We have vendors to pay. We have commercial leases. If you pull that funding, the entire company collapses by Monday morning. I will have to declare immediate bankruptcy. That sounds like a severe crisis, I noted, maintaining a mask of cold professional detachment. You should definitely hire a crisis management firm to help you navigate the fallout. Unfortunately, My roster is currently full. Harper, who had been sitting frozen in the guest chair, suddenly jolted upright. The sociological theories and the progressive buzzwords were completely gone. The reality of her own impending financial ruin had just crashed through her performative facade. She turned to her husband, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Malik," she gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. "Malik, what does she mean she called in the loan? We just closed on the summer house in Connecticut. The down payment took all our liquid savings. The mortgage on this house, the private school tuition for the kids. Malik, if the business goes under, how are we going to pay the banks?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk, offering her a chillingly polite smile. "You are not going to pay the banks, Harper," I explained smoothly. "Without Malik's artificially inflated CEO salary, your debt-to-income ratio is going to trigger immediate defaults across all your luxury assets. The bank is going to foreclose on your primary residence within 90 days. That beautiful summer house in Connecticut will be seized. Your children will be pulled from their elite private academies. You are going to lose everything that makes you feel superior to the people you love to patronize." Harper stood up, her hands shaking wildly. She turned her panicked gaze toward her husband. "Malik, you have to fix this. You cannot let her do this to us. You need to call your lawyers. You need to stop her." Malik's shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, violent anger, but he did not direct it at me. He knew I held all the cards, and he knew he was completely powerless against my corporate infrastructure. Instead, he turned his fury directly onto the woman standing next to him. He spun around and pointed a trembling finger right in Harper's face. "Fix this!" Malik shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls of my office. "You want me to fix this? This is your fault. I told you to stay out of it. I told you to let me handle Trey's mess. But you just had to come down here. You just had to march into her office and run your mouth. You had to give her a lecture about systemic pressure and act like you run the world. I was trying to help your brother." Harper shrieked, tears of genuine panic streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "I was trying to defend your family. You were trying to hear yourself talk." Malik roared, stepping closer to her. "You never cared about Trey. You just wanted to feel important. And now you just bankrupted my entire company because you could not keep your arrogant mouth shut. My business is gone, Harper. Everything I built is gone because you had to play the savior." I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms and watching the spectacular implosion of their marriage. It was a flawless execution of consequence delivery. 30 minutes ago, they had formed a united front marching into my territory to shame me into submission. Now they were viciously tearing each other apart, completely forgetting about Trey, completely ignoring their moral high ground, fighting like feral animals for their own survival. "This is the reality of the systemic pressure you love discussing, Harper," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through their shouting match. "It is the very real pressure of a bank calling in a loan you cannot pay because your entire lifestyle is built on someone else's money. I highly suggest you take all that radical empathy you were preaching about and apply it to your husband's impending bankruptcy filings." Malik grabbed Harper by the arm, pulling her roughly toward the office door. "We are leaving," he growled, his face a mask of absolute defeat and rage. I pressed the button on my intercom system. "Sarah," I called out, my tone bright and professional. "Please escort my brother-in-law and his wife to the elevators. They are completely finished here." The heavy glass door swung open. Sarah stood in the hallway, maintaining a polite corporate smile as Malik dragged a weeping, hyperventilating Harper out of my office. They did not look back. They continued screaming at each other down the long corridor, their voices echoing against the marble floors, until the elevator doors finally closed, swallowing their panic entirely. I remained seated at my desk, taking a slow, deep breath of the quiet air. The supporting cast had been systematically neutralized, and their financial lifelines were permanently severed. The battlefield was completely cleared. There was only one loose end left to tie up, and he was currently waiting for a divorce settlement he thought he was going to win. I picked up my pen, ready to draft the final chapter of Trey's absolute destruction. Exactly 1 month later, the sterile fluorescent lighting of the downtown mediation center illuminated the absolute physical toll that consequence delivery takes on a man. I sat perfectly composed in my tailored charcoal suit at one side of the long mahogany conference table. Marcus sat to my right, organizing a single immaculate stack of folders. Across the table sat the ghost of the man I used to call my husband. Trey looked terrible. The confident swagger and the puffed-out chest were entirely gone. He was wearing an off-the-rack suit that fit him poorly, a stark contrast to the custom Italian tailoring he used to buy with my corporate funds. Dark circles hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped a cheap plastic pen. He had spent the last 30 days living in Malik and Harper's cramped guest room, watching his brother's business collapse and his daughter drop out of her elite sorority. The stress of actual reality had aged him 10 years in 4 weeks. Despite his pathetic physical state, his supreme entitlement had not completely evaporated. He was still clinging to the delusion that he could extract one final payday from my empire. His attorney, a balding man who looked equally exhausted, cleared his throat and opened the negotiations with a profoundly ridiculous opening statement. The opposing counsel launched into a deeply rehearsed monologue about how Trey had grown accustomed to a highly elevated standard of living during our 5-year marriage. He argued that Trey was a devoted, supportive partner who had sacrificed his own upward career mobility to manage the household and support my demanding schedule as a corporate executive. Because I was the primary breadwinner by a massive margin, they were officially requesting $10,000 a month in permanent spousal support, along with a lump sum payout to help him secure appropriate housing. Trey actually had the audacity to lower his head and pinch the bridge of his nose, performing the role of the discarded, broken-hearted husband. He let out a shaky sigh, whispering to the mediator about how much he had loved me and how cruelly I had thrown him out onto the street without a single dollar to his name. He painted himself as a victim of a ruthless, wealthy woman who simply got bored of her marriage and discarded him like trash. He looked across the table at me, trying to project a look of profound betrayal. He wanted the mediator to feel sorry for him. He wanted me to feel a twinge of guilt. He wanted a paycheck for his pain. I did not break eye contact. I did not shift in my chair. I just let his attorney finish outlining their absurd financial demands, allowing the echo of their entitlement to settle into the quiet room. Marcus slowly reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick navy blue folder, laying it perfectly flat on the polished mahogany table. He did not say a single word. He simply slid it across the smooth surface until it rested right against the trembling hands of Trey's attorney. I did not bother to argue or explain. I knew that in the world of high-stakes crisis management, when you hold undeniable absolute facts, you do not need to waste your breath raising your voice. You simply let the raw numbers do the execution for you. Trey's attorney opened the folder, and I watched the exact moment the text on the very first page registered in his brain. The smug, confident smirk he had been wearing all morning instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked down at the documents, then up at Trey, then back at me, his forehead suddenly breaking out in a cold sweat. This is the result of a comprehensive 6-month forensic fraud audit covering every single one of my client's corporate accounts, Marcus said, his voice freezing the air in the room. We have traced every transaction, every automatic withdrawal, and every single fabricated invoice your client authorized. Congratulations, Trey. You are not just walking away from this marriage without a dime of spousal support. You have officially signed your own federal criminal indictment. Trey snatched the heavy folder from his lawyer's hands, his eyes darting frantically across the financial charts and bank statements. The file contained irrefutable concrete evidence of massive-scale embezzlement. He had been quietly siphoning over $200,000 from my media company's operating funds over the past 3 years to finance his family's luxurious lifestyle, from Jada's car to Malik's business debts. He had created fake vendor accounts and forged signatures on phantom service invoices, genuinely believing my accounting department would never catch the discrepancies. His attorney leaned over and whispered into Trey's ear, his voice laced with panic and absolute defeat. Trey, this is completely out of my hands now. This is no longer a civil divorce settlement. This is a federal felony. They have enough hard evidence to hand this over to the FBI by tomorrow morning. If this goes to trial, you are looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of bail. I leaned back in my chair, intertwining my fingers and staring directly at the crumbling man sitting across from me. The arrogance was completely gone, leaving nothing but a pathetic, trembling shell facing the reality of a prison sentence. You have exactly two choices right here and right now, Trey, I said, my tone carrying absolute final authority. Option 1. You relinquish every single claim to my assets. Sign this settlement agreement, leaving with nothing. Take full responsibility for your personal debts and vanish from my life forever. Option 2. You walk out of that door with your pride, and I personally hand-deliver this audit to the district attorney and the FBI before the sun goes down. You will get a brand new rent-free place to live, but it will have iron bars on the windows. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide the rest of your life. Trey looked at the imaginary $10,000 check he had just demanded, then down at the cheap plastic pen resting in his hand. He turned to look through the glass partition of the waiting room, seeing his mother Vivian and his sister-in-law Harper sitting there oblivious. He realized in that agonizing moment that not a single person could save him. With his shoulders completely slumped and his fingers shaking violently, Trey picked up the pen and signed the documents forfeiting everything. He was officially walking away with nothing, stripped of his honor, stripped of his money, and entirely crushed by the devastating weight of his own greed. The fallout from that afternoon in the mediation center was swift and absolute. Without my corporate infrastructure propping up their manufactured empire, the entire family collapsed under the heavy weight of their own inadequacy. Jada's designer lifestyle vanished overnight. When the tuition checks for Spelman College stopped clearing, she was unceremoniously forced to withdraw from her classes. The entitled girl who once screamed at me over a spilled drink on a luxury handbag now wears a stained green apron, working 40 hours a week as a barista at a local coffee shop. She spends her days wiping down tables and taking iced espresso orders from the exact same wealthy sorority sisters she used to command. Malik and Harper fared no better. With my venture capital firm officially calling in their massive loan, Malik's supply chain startup completely imploded. The banks aggressively moved in to seize their assets. Harper's performative activism and progressive therapy vocabulary could not save her from the brutal reality of impending bankruptcy. They were forced to sell their Connecticut summer home and auction off their luxury vehicles just to keep their primary residence out of foreclosure. They now spend their days trapped in a bitter and resentful marriage, entirely consumed by the staggering debt they brought upon themselves by choosing to cross me. As for Vivian, the ultimate architect of their family entitlement, the social destruction was entirely devastating. The neighborhood gossip surrounding the police intervention on her lawn, the towed Mercedes, and Trey's sudden eviction spread through the Buckhead community and her congregation like wildfire. Stripped of her golden son's fabricated success, Vivian was quietly forced to step down from all of her prestigious church committees. She now sits isolated in her house, far too humiliated to face the judgmental whispers of the very women she used to spend her weekends trying to impress. The evening sun casts long golden shadows across the hardwood floors of my penthouse living room. The city of Atlanta glows brilliantly beneath me, a sprawling grid of bright lights and endless opportunity. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, perfectly composed, turning the crystal stem of my wine glass between my fingers. The air in my home is cool, silent, and entirely mine. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine. A sharp, triumphant smile curves my lips as I look out over the city I conquered. They really thought my silence was submission. They looked at my calm demeanor and foolishly mistook it for weakness. But they forgot the most dangerous rule of all. The silence of a crisis manager is never a surrender. It is simply the sound of her reloading.